Hello and welcome to Apologetics 101. Welcome to the Tomkins controversy. And today we are specifically dealing with Erika versus created kinds. Okay, why would I be doing a created kinds video for the Tomkins controversy? I plan on doing one for the Genesis series as well, but why would I do one for the Tomkins controversy? Because during the course of the discussion in the original videos, one of the first errors that I noticed is that she had misrepresented our position on created cons. Now, in the YEC position, the view that we're looking at just like the amount of similarity or dissimilarity is false. That's what evolutionists do. Evolutionists assume that the more genetic similarity that someone has with someone, that automatically means they're related. They automatically assume that. That's not actually true. We're going to get more into that as we move forward, but that's not actually true. It's the way in which something is similar or dissimilar. You could be very similar genetically, which is not hard to do. I mean, there's only 4 bases in the DNA language, and biology typically have the same similar biochemistries and things like that. So you're going to be able to find a lot of similarities as a result. We have a common designer and so forth. But the fact that there's a lot of similarity between two things does not necessarily mean they're related. Like I said, we're going to get more into that as we move forward. But similarity does not automatically equal, or the amount of similarity doesn't automatically equal that they're related. So in the YEC view, we determine created kinds by the way in which two things are similar. In other words, they have fundamental characteristics that are in common with one another that makes them part of that grouping. Okay, that's essentially what it is. Whether it be morphological, whether it be genetically, whether it be biologically, I think all 3 of those can be substantiated as part of the created kinds, and so we can be able to do that. Um, Erika, of course, doesn't think so. She thinks that there's no boundary for the created kinds, and it's disputed among young Earth creationists, which is not the case. Not exactly. I mean, they might dispute over whether this is its own kind or not, or whatnot, but there's no actual boundary debate or anything like that. We understand what we believe, and our position is that it's the way in which two things are alike or different. It's not how much they are alike or different. Well, in the course of her original response video to Tomkins, she said, "Oh well, look here. If we use Tomkins's method, this would make two things of the same kind more different than two things that you don't think are the same kind, such as humans and apes." But that's not correct. For start with, she didn't really replicate. In fact, she's never replicated Tomkins' method correctly. Even her newer stuff, she divided by the Corey length, which Tomkins didn't do, and that sort of thing. So she's a lot of other mistakes she made, and so she never replicated it. And her original ones were bogus results anyhow. But it really doesn't matter as far as that goes, because you can actually, in the YC position, you can actually have two things that are the same kind and have more or less differences than two things that are not the same kind. Because we don't look at the amount of similarity or differences. It's not how much they are similar or different that we look at. It's the way in which they are similar or different that we look at. And I've tried to explain this to Erika several times. She acts like I'm talking vague and ambiguous, and I'm not. I'm being as precise as possible, but she doesn't understand that. But she makes this video. Apparently, yours truly is the inspiration of it. That where she responds to created kinds. She doesn't respond through most of the video to me directly. She only responds to me at the end. That's usually the MO of my dealings with Erika. Whenever she responds to me, she kind of pushes me to the end of the videos. That's what she did in the live video when she first responded to my interview with Dr. Jeffrey Tomkins. She just kind of pushed me toward the end. And so that's what she did. She pushed me toward the end and responded to me in a section of it. We're going to be going over those clips today. But before I do that, I'm going to go through some notes. See, I took a lot of very detailed notes. I took really, really detailed notes and pages and pages of notes. So yeah, and we're going to be going through those, and I did basically in the form of points. I've got 6 points up, but each point has a lot of sub notes, so it's got like notes under there as well. So I'm gonna be going through it, try to go through it as fast as possible, and until I get to the 5th point. When I get to the 5th point, I will play the clip, and then I will go through the clip and stop it when I need to show what errors she's making there, and then I'll give you my overall impressions at the end of the video. So sounds like a plan. But any given case, let's without further ado, let's dive in. Essentially, she makes this video about creating cons. She misrepresents her position constantly, and she constantly assumes her position. As you'll see, that's a constant theme there during the course of the video. I will be linking the video in the description box below if you want to do your own evaluation of it. The errors are for the most part, pretty obvious. Some of them I had to actually look into, but almost all of them are very, very obvious. You'll see the misrepresentations. You'll see her where she assumes her position in the process, and a lot of logical errors, factual errors, all kinds of other mistakes that she made all throughout the course of the video. But anyway, the first one I've got on my list of notes is she misdefines created kinds. All right. We do not hold to the idea that life was created more or less in its present form. You can have big changes within a kind. Essentially put, she claims, that's how she defines it, like more or less in its present form. That's not what we believe. 1, we believe that speciation occurs. 2, we do believe that changes do occur. And 3, we do believe that you can have big changes within a kind. It's really not about the fact that organisms change over time, and it's not about the fact that the amount of change that's happened over time. It's about the direction of change. It's about the way in which you're claiming that these organisms change in order to produce all life on Earth, such as the fact that new information needs to be added to the genome, the fact that fundamental characteristics that identifies it as a particular kind is being changed and evolving into things that with information that it doesn't that particular kind didn't have previously. And so it's the direction of change you're going. Instead of a vertical change, which is what young Earth creationists believe in. We believe that these are changing vertically. They believe in a horizontal change. And we're saying no, that the direction of change, the way in which you're claiming these things are changing, no. They can change vertically within the kind, but they can't change horizontally. And that's what evolutionists are claiming. Now, we're not claiming that. We don't believe that they change horizontally. We don't believe that they change outside of their kind. And so so evolutionists try to attack what we believe on created kinds. They don't understand what we believe on created kinds. Sometimes they're willing to voice this, like they'll say, "Well, we don't understand where y'all think that created kinds, start and end and things like that." And they try to compare it to the modern classification system. You can go only so far with the modern classification system because the classification system is man-made. It is absolutely conventional. Okay, you cannot sit there and assume that it's universal fact, like we just discovered the way we need to classify these things. That's not the case. Whether the classification system is less than 300 years old, we can't bring it and try to put it back into scripture, when the Bible was written, because the Bible was written thousands of years ago versus, the modern classification system, which is one, man-made, and two, invented about 300 years ago. Well, less than 300 years ago, actually. And so we can't sit there and assume that represents universal fact. We could probably get close to a classification of the classification system. Like, for example, a lot of creationists will go with family. That usually is generally, in most cases, it would probably likely be in the family. But it's not always in the family. Sometimes it might be order, sometimes it may be genus. There's a few cases there even might be species related, but it doesn't happen very often. But it does happen on occasion, depending on how you're classifying these things. And of course, the word species is actually debated. We might get into a little bit more of that later. But the word species is actually debated. But in any given case, so it could vary. It's not that we don't have a set pattern. It's the fact that we're basing this on biblical kinds, which did not have the modern classification system invented at that time. Okay? So it doesn't make they're wrong. It doesn't mean the way we classify them is wrong necessarily. It just simply means it's conventional. It's man-made. It's how we are identifying them today. And so the modern classification system cannot be taken. You can't take something the concept that was invented, within the last 300 years and extrapolate it backwards to biblical times. They were written thousands of years ago, and try to sit there and force that into it. That's a fallacy in word study called semantic anachronism fallacy. She commits that too in this video. You cannot do that. Okay, so that's the reason why the concept of created kinds cannot fall exactly, in every case in a particular classification or modern classification system, because it didn't exist in the time of the Bible. It didn't exist until less than 300 years ago. And a lot of skeptics don't realize that. They treat the classification system like we discovered it rather than, it being invented, being made up. But in reality, it was made up. It's not... I'm not saying that it's completely arbitrary. I mean, they base it on different various things, but it's not It's not universally factual. It's just conventional. It's a made up system of how you choose to identify these particular organisms. That's it in a nutshell. But we cannot sit there and assume that just because we can today classify them that way, that's the way that we're going to always classify them. Biblical kinds comes from Scripture, which was written thousands of years ago, so we're basing it on that, and therefore, in most cases, it will fall in family area, but not always, and that's what we're trying to get across. And in order to sit there and say, hey, it's always family level, no matter what, that will commit the semantic anachronism fallacy, because it doesn't take into account the way in which Scripture actually identifies it, and the fact that the modern classification system is man-made. It's conventional. It's invented. And again, I'm not suggesting that it's wrong to classify them that way, although I do think there's a lot of evolutionary presuppositions that go into the modern classification system, and they even try to add extinct animals in there too, and so forth. She actually talks a little bit about that too, but she assumes that the classification system is universal. All the way through her video, she assumes that it's just universal fact and that we have to judge created kinds based upon how we identify these things today. And that's just not the case. All right, let's move on. I do want to point out something because I actually have a quote from Dr. Carter. A while back, I had told Dr. Rob Carter about a comment that Erika had made on his channel in his video to him, but he misunderstood me and thought that she had made her response video to me, which she did, to him, which she hadn't made at that time. She hasn't since then, but she hadn't made it at that time. And he misunderstood that, went to her channel, didn't see it, but did see the Created Cons video because that was the last one she did at the time. And so he watched like 6 minutes of it and then responded on that video. I wanted to quote Rob Carter on that because it's interesting because Erika considers Rob Carter a professional creationist, and he also thought she misdefined Created Cons. Let me show that. All right. Here, Dr. Rob Carter on Erika's video concerning Created Cons. He wrote, I do not see a response video from her. Her latest video is on Created Cons. She misdefines. Listen to this. That's what he said. She misdefines them in the beginning and appears unaware of my braided Bergman concept entirely. I'm not sure exactly on that one. But I could not stomach more than 6 minutes, which I don't blame him. All right, but yeah, I just wanted to point that out before I leave that. That he because this is not just my position represent mainstream. Okay, this is mainstream young Earth views. We've constantly told them that the issue is not over the fact that organisms change over time or the amount even. It's really over the direction of change. It's over how these things are being claimed to have changed, and that's what it's over. And a lot of people don't understand, at least a lot of evolutionists, at least they act like they don't understand. But that's what it's really over. And we've constantly said that over and over and over and over again. So there's no excuse for these misidentifications. But she seems to be making the focus about how much they are similar or different. As if suddenly our position must be disproven, because after all, they find out that this is the case over here, and it's like, no, because it doesn't really matter. Let's say, for example, humans and chimps really were 96 to 98%. Would that really impact our view on created cons? Not at all. It's possible that the 2 to 4% difference, even if that was the case, 2 to 4% difference could be the result of that, or they could end up having those could be fundamental differences which distinguish two different organisms from each other and prevent hybridization of those two kinds, and that's possible. So even though they're only 4% different, it doesn't. And the 96%, 96 to 98% could be superficial difference, a lot of superficial differences, and differences that doesn't impact interbreeding and things like that. So in other words, we don't. It wouldn't matter in our view if that was the case. Now I don't think that is the case because it's once you factor in the unalienable regions of the genome. These algorithms are being used to only look for similarities, not differences. And once you factor in the unalienable regions, the similarities will drop and the differences will increase. And I'll explain more on that later on. But let's move on. All right, let's do point number 2. Her claim of why we adopt fixity of kinds instead of fixity of species is historically inaccurate. I want to quote Nathaniel Jensen. I actually contacted Nathaniel Jensen on this, and since then I actually saw a really good article on Answers in Genesis website. I won't go to that article, but I will probably be referencing certain historical information from that. But in order to explain this a little bit better, I wanted to be able to quote Nathaniel Jensen, and I did ask him if it would be okay if I did that. So I put the insert of the email in in my slides here. All right, here we are. Charles Darwin versus Carlos Linnaeus, if I pronounced that correctly. He said, good question. It's one that critics like to raise. However, Linnaeus changed his view on the fixity of species later in his life and long before Darwin published views on evolution nearly a century later. In other words, the criticism is based on an ignorant view of history. From email exchange with Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's with Answers in Genesis, and this was on Carlos Linnaeus. If I understand Carlos Linnaeus correctly, the deal with that is that Linnaeus is the one who came up with the modern classification system, and he actually changed his views later on in his life. Now, just to kind of put a much more deeper context on this, the word species actually used to mean something close to family. It changed its definition later on down the road, or people began to refer to species as a subgroup of family, and I mean, there's still debates even today on the word species. The word species is heavily debated today, so they don't know, which I think is so hypocritical of people like Erika, who thinks there's no boundary for created kinds, and then they can't even decide what species really means. So they debate that constantly. So it's kind of hypocritical. But anyway, they debate species a lot, so it's still debated today. But by and large, they all agree now that the species is a subgroup of family. A long time ago, however, Linnaeus originally thought that the species was like I said, same as family, and then later on later in his life, he does change his view from species to believing in fixity of species to fixity of kinds, or that the issue end up changing, or the definition of species end up changing, and as a result, people started saying, "How can you believe in fixity of species, and we know species change," and so they sat there and said, well, we're gonna have to, in order to communicate better what we're saying, we need to sit there and start referring to this as fixity of kinds, and so they did. A lot of people were doing. It's basically a fallacy in logic called a bait and switch, otherwise known as equivocation fallacy. It's when you change where the conversation is in the middle, or in the middle of the conversation. Like you change from, like, okay, the term species originally meant family, but then you change the meaning of the word species, and so now it means a subgroup of a family, even though people are still using species like that. And so they end up having to say, okay, it's fixity of kinds. But they never really changed their belief on fixity of kinds. It was always fixity of kinds. But they just started saying it like that in order to be much more understandable to the people at large, because people had changed how people understood the word species. And so that's essentially how that went. And Erika has pounced on this and made it look like that our entire argument on fixity of kinds was nothing more than a post hoc argument. Like we only came up with that because now we see species change, and you see families develop new species, within a particular family and things like that. And that's not our view at all. Our view was always fixity of kinds. It's just we had to change how we said it, because species change. They changed the definition of species. So the everyone's understanding of what the word species meant changed. It's still debated today, but it essentially it is it's no longer considered a family group. It's more closer to a kind of a subgroup of a family. And by and large, that regardless of what their debates are on species, most people usually agree that on species. And so we had to change how we said it. And so we ended up changing it to fixity of kinds in order to be able to spell out what we're really saying. Because kinds does not necessarily equate to what people today mean by the word species. And it may not always equate to family, but most of the time it equates to family. Most of the time. But there are occasions where it may equate to order, which is above family. There's times when it may equate to genus, which is below family. And there's even a rare time that it may equate to species. Doesn't happen very often, maybe a few times. I think Donny has a position where he thinks that different various Donny from Badinsky from Standing for Truth has a view where he thinks different primates like chimps and bonobos are a different kind from gorillas and orangutans and things like that, and so whether species specific. Well, I'm going to add this in post production. I'm going to add this in the editing process. Essentially, I wanted to cover real quickly. I didn't add this in the original video, but I'm going to add it here. Donny Badinsky carried a clip that he made that I actually just when I decided to save this as an extra clip in case I ever need it. I don't think I ever actually used this in my videos, but he went over what he thought on apes, and I want to give you like that as an example of a rare cases where species might be species specific in certain cases. It doesn't always equate to that, and usually it doesn't. But Donnie believes that with primates it does, and there's even times with dinosaurs that it might. So without further ado, I'm gonna clip over to or switch over to that one, and so that way we can air Donnie's reference. This has been made into another presentation that he did, but I don't think I might not. I don't know if I actually I kept it as a separate clip, but I don't know whether or not if I actually include it in any of my other previous videos where I have his interviews. I could have, but I don't remember if I did. But either way, I'm gonna show the clip here.
There actually had human-specific repetitive elements in it that you don't even find in apes.
There are specific repetitive elements like that are species specific, right? Like he's trying to draw this dichotomy. You find this stuff in humans and you find this stuff in apes. There is no way to do that, right? If you want to say you find human specific stuff, then whatever that thing is that you're looking at, take orphan genes, for example. There are human specific orphan genes. There are also chimp specific orphan genes and gorilla specific orphan genes and orangutan specific orphan genes. They're only found in them. But there are orphan genes that are ape specific that don't include humans. You see what I mean?
And so,
okay, do you know what she's arguing there, and whether it's valid or not?
Yes. I'll share my screen and show why the model that I hold to, and the model that Christopher Roohif holds to, and a lot of young Earth creationists, her argument doesn't provide us with a challenge or a problem, because you'll notice the phylogeny here. This is the separate ancestry model. This is what I hold to, and this is what I've been confirming using mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome, orphan genes, DNA function, other taxonomically restricted genes, linkage blocks. Okay, so right. Yes, we would agree that a lot of these sequences and DNA elements are species specific. But you know what? It falls in line with our model here. So you got Homo sapiens, humans, that all belong to one kind. And then I would argue that you basically have, within your primates, you have gorillas as their own kind, chimpanzees and bonobos as their own kind, and then orangutans as their own kind. And so I wouldn't argue that your gorillas are related to your chimps. And so if there's species specific sequences or species specific orphan genes, it more or less lines up with the phylogeny I have here. Now, if I was a creationist who said, you know what, gorillas and chimps and bonobos all belong to the same kind, then there might be a challenge. That might be something I need to work out, right? But I think the data suggests that gorillas and chimps are their own specific kind. And what's funny is the Y chromosome data Brian, trying to find it real quick for you, actually supports this. Notice this. This is from the secular literature. This is from the conventional literature. This is from a paper, The Y Chromosomes of the Great Apes, 2017. Notice the differences in Y chromosome. You got your human Y chromosome, which is totally different to the chimpanzee Y chromosome. Half the size, totally different in gene content. This makes sense. Humans and chimps are separate created kinds. But you'll notice the gorilla Y chromosome is actually more similar to the human Y than either are to the chimpanzee Y. And so again, this confirms what I'm saying. Humans are a separate kind. Chimpanzees and bonobos are a separate kind. Gorillas are their own separate kind. And then your orangutans are their own separate kind. And so you have multiple separate kinds here within primates. And so sure, some of these genes, some of these sequences are species specific, but overall the pattern seems to fit this phylogeny. Does that make sense and help, Brian?
Yeah, so you would see the primates similar to the way they a lot of younger Christians see the dinosaurs, where yeah, you have this group called dinosaurs, but there's like several different kinds within the dinosaurs,
Right.
and that sort of thing. And so we wouldn't necessarily classify all dinosaurs as the same kind. So you would sit there and look at primates and say, yes, we have this large group of primates, but there are different types of primates that are different kinds, and you've got the label of chimp-like ancestor. I guess chimps are considered great apes. Would you classify all great apes as one kind?
No, I would say so. Yeah, basically gorillas, orangutans, chimps, those are great apes. Humans, evolutionary taxonomists would argue that humans are human great apes. I wouldn't argue that.
I wouldn't either.
Taxonomy is very subjective, very arbitrary. But so I would say gorillas. So you can see in the phylogeny here, notice gorillas, gorilla-like ancestor up to the modern day gorilla. Chimps, there's a split here, bonobos and chimps. So essentially what you have is gorillas in their own kind, chimps and bonobos in their own kind, orangutans in their own kind, Australopithecines, a separate group altogether, and then humans, their own kind. So you're looking at about three
Am
or
I
four
understanding that, or at least based on your graph, that you would agree with Dr. Peter Line on Australopithecines being its own kind of creature?
Great question. In a nutshell, I would argue that your entire Australopithecine collection, if you were to just take every single bone that's labeled Australopithecus, I would say you have a mix of human bones and Australopithecus ape bones. There's been some human bones mixed in, but if you were to take out all the human bones and now all you're left with are your ape bones, I would say that right there is your Australopithecus group, essentially an extinct form of primate.
That's my thinking on it as well.
Yeah.
Because I'm like of the mindset of thinking that there are chimeric. I mean, there's questions and disputes about what exactly is chimeric. You know, as far as you know, is this human or is this, you know, just, you know, something that's maybe human-like, but it's not really human at all. And so there are disputes of exactly which bone would classify as human or fossil. But I think that most everybody, even Peter Line, agrees that there were some examples of fossils being mixed in and that sort of thing. So it's just a question of the parts which appear to be ape-like, such as the skulls of like Australopithecus afarensis and so forth. That definitely represents a particular kind, and so you would probably put all of the Australopithecus of that nature as an extinct primate in a particular kind. Is that correct?
Exactly. So this group right here, Australopithecine-like ancestors, I think in the fossil record we can find variations of that kind, but notice here at the top, now extinct. So they don't exist anymore. We just find them in fossils. If they existed now, they would essentially be you know, fourth genus of ape. But at the same time, I don't know if I want to call them ape, because in the same way that you have monkeys that are not necessarily apes, they're monkeys, old world monkeys, new world monkeys, lemurs. You know, Australopithecines might just be their own distinct group.
You might
of
find you have a
primates.
lot more in common with Dr. Line, because he considers them apish primates, but he doesn't consider them apes. He thinks of them
Right.
as their own group. So he doesn't consider them considered part of that they would be considered apes. He doesn't consider them chimps. He thinks there's elements of that, but he says they're not chimps, they're not humans. He qualifies them as a separate thing.
Right. Yeah. They're extinct. And, your gorillas, chimps, orangutans, these are great apes. Old world monkeys, new world monkeys in general, from my understanding, evolutionary taxonomists would not consider them apes. They would consider them primates. They'd consider them monkeys. They'd consider them mammals, but not great apes. And I think that's the same thing with your Australopithecines. They are primates, but I don't know if I want to categorize them as great apes. I think they're just a separate group of primates altogether that we as humans actually seem to share more with than we share even with like gorillas and chimps. So basically they're their own category. They are extinct now. I do believe a lot of human bones were mixed in with the group of bones called Australopithecines.
As
But
well
again,
as maybe other Australopithecines could be mixed in with it. There's some
yeah, that's a
similarities.
great point.
There's a similarities with Prometheus. There's similarities with that of Africanus and even distinguishable traits. I think the original founder of Prometheus, Clark, discovered that the head of Prometheus was very different from Africanus, which is why he classified it as its own species, which he titled Prometheus. And so that shows kind of like the reason for that, those similarities and differences could be because it's not that it could have bones mixed in with it. But then again, it could just simply be that they have similarities and dissimilarities. But either way, Clark then I try to identify the species as distinct from Africanus. So there's questions about whether it should be classified as Africanus or whether it should be classified as its own species, Prometheus. So it just depends on and depending on which evolutionists you talk to, because I mean there are evolutionists that think that it should be classified as Africanus, and there's evolutionists that think that it should be classified as Prometheus. So it just depends on who you
Who you're talking. Even Lee Berger recognizes that Australopithecus afarensis is a chimera, a mix of bones from multiple species. In his view, I believe it's multiple species of Australopithecine mixed into one chimeric creature.
And so as a result, and you could have that, right, in the YEC position. It just doesn't happen very often as far as species goes. And so, it doesn't equate always to species even. So it wouldn't be exactly correct to even say species. And most of the time it usually don't equate to species. And so what young Earth creationists have gotten saying is referring to kinds. If you're comparing it to a modern classification system, most of the time it will equate to family. Sometimes it equates to order, sometimes it equates to genus. A few times it may even equate to species, but not very often. But sometimes it does. But it's always created kinds. It's always its own group. And this is the biblical classification of it. And it doesn't always equate to things of our modern classification system, because our modern classification system is man-made and less than 300 years old. And Erika doesn't understand that, and she treats the modern classification system like it's universal, like it's for all time, like we discovered how these things ought to be classified. And that's not the case. All right, let's go to point number 3, straw man argument. She's constantly misrepresenting our position throughout the course of her video. There's one straw man that she did that I was really surprised by. When I was in college, and anytime I take any classes that reference logical fallacies and mention straw man arguments. Do you know the one example that they will often give of a straw man argument? The claim that all animals that exist today was on Noah's Ark. That's a misrepresentation of our position. We don't hold to the idea that all the animals that exist today was on Noah's Ark. That would be ridiculous. We don't hold to that. Whether we hold to two of every kind that existed in Noah's day was on Noah's Ark. Okay? So in other words, of course those kinds exist today, but the species themselves obviously biodiversified since the time of Noah. And so there's a lot more animals that exist today than existed at the time of Noah. And even in the time of Noah, we don't think all the animals were on Noah's Ark. We just think two of every kind of air-breathing animals that breathe breath of air through their nostrils was on Noah's Ark. So we don't think the sea creatures were on it. A lot of creationists doubt whether insects was on it or not. They could have survived by floating on vegetation and that sort of thing. Although some, even if they were on it, they're really small, so two of every kind wouldn't be much. You could fit them in a shoebox in the corner of the ark of all the space that would take. But anyway, so it's not really as bad as they think it is. And so they often misrepresent it. And I was really surprised to find that Erika had done this very misrepresentation of our position. She had strawman our argument, or strawman our position on this, because our position is not that every animal that exists today was on Noah's Ark. She goes into detail in this where she accused us of post hoc and things like that, and that was not the case. I guess the idea is that she wants to justify her strawman argument, assuming that every animal was on Noah's Ark, by refuting what we today refer to as criticons. I think that's what she was trying to do. It didn't work very well for her, but she was trying to do that. I see people doing all times where they will make a fallacy in logic, and then they will try to go and justify that fallacy, justify that logical error, and there's just no justification for it. She had misrepresented our position on how we allow larger changes. You can have big changes within a kind, like I mentioned before. And there are like tons and tons of misrepresentation. One of the things you will find throughout the course of this video, and I'll probably mention in my closing, is you'll find these two things are consistent in her video: misrepresentations and assuming her position. That's what she just kept doing back and forth. Sometimes she would misrepresent her position. Sometimes she would just assume her position. Sometimes she would do both. The later happened far more than any others. And so she would just kind of misrepresent her position and assume her position in the process. And that happened throughout the course of this video. All right, the fourth point is the begging question fallacy. As already mentioned, that the begging question fallacy is basically when you assume your position. It's basically when you assume position while trying to disprove another person's position. It's also known as a circular argument. It's also known as circular reasoning. And the technical term is begging the question. And that's exactly what you see throughout the course of this video. You'll see her begging the question. I remember one time she sat there and said that she doesn't think that created kinds can be determined by how they are different, because look at how much that they are similar, like 96-98%, and it's like, okay, so what she did was misrepresented our position and then assumed that hers is correct, and that's based on the amount of similarity to similarity and that sort of thing. But that's not the case. There's also a thing in there where there's an inheritance, where she actually makes some factual mistakes in that. Because even with genetic inheritance, even with that, it's still the way in which two people are the same. We inherit certain physical traits and genetic information from our parents, and they inherited certain ones from their parents. And so it's not the amount of similarity to similarity. If it was the amount of similarity and dissimilarity that makes us related, then our great 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 grandpa, which is going to be far removed in terms of the amount of similarity and dissimilarity, won't be related to us, even though technically they are. It's not what, it's not how much they are similar or dissimilar that makes something related. It is the way in which they're similar and dissimilar that makes them related. And so even in case of genetic inheritance, you and family trees, that remains to be true. So it's not the amount. If it was the amount, then if you have a really distant cousin or a really distant uncle or a really distant grandfather somewhere along the lines of your family tree, technically you wouldn't be related to them. because it would mean you wouldn't have not that much in common. But if you take two people on the street, like if I just take a stranger and genetically compare them with me, we're gonna find ourselves to be within 4% different and 96% similar. So it's really 96% or more. And even though they're not directly genealogically related to me. So it's not the amount of similarity to dissimilarity. You can find lots and lots of similarities and dissimilarities, but it's really the way in which someone is similar or dissimilar to them that makes them related. And because I have genes inside me from my great grandparents, that passed on to their parents and passed on to their parents, passed on to me, and so forth. And a lot of these genes are dormant, but there's a lot that are active as well. And so that's what creates the physiological characteristics that I have. And when me and my wife had a son, Luke, he's 13 now, and he has all the genetic characteristics of me and my mom, and of course, his mom, and of course our parents who passed their genetic information on to us. So it's not the amount of similarity to dissimilarity; it's the way in which two things are alike and different. That's what is being compared, not the amount. So she kind of misunderstood that and assumed that it's all about looking at how much they are similar and dissimilar in order to determine relatedness, and that's just not the case. She assumed evolution quite often. Very often she assumed evolutionary views. When she was doing the thing, assuming that if they're 98% similar, then that must mean they're related, and things like that. So she's constantly assuming evolutionary views during the course of this video. Alright, I'm at the 5th point, so we're going to show the clipping and get right into it.
So I want to talk a little bit about my inspiration for making this video, and that's our good old friend Brian of Apologetics 101. This is a comment that he made responding to me. I left a comment on a more recent video by Rob Carter responding to my Tomkins video. I was going to say series, and I guess it kind of is. And I have a lot to say about Rob Carter's work on my Tomkins stuff. A lot to say. There's actually tests just running out of frame here, so I'm excited to get to that, but we're not going to be discussing that today. We're going to be talking about Brian's take on kinds, because I think it really speaks to where your lay creationists might be at with regard to understanding what Bergmans are and what the problems are for them as a concept.
What in the world is a lay creationist here? Is it a part-time creationist? I think she tries to use that. She also has a concept where she calls professional creationist. And I think what she means by that is someone who has a career path, like they're getting paid for it and that sort of thing. But creationists are just creationists. We're not professional creationists. We're not lay creationists. We're not part-time creationists. Because none of that makes any sense. We're just creationists. Rob Carter's a creationist. I'm a creationist, and that's the way it goes. I'm not a layman to begin with. I've got a degree up there. Let's make sure y'all can see it. All right, right there. I got a degree. I've been to college, working on my next degree. Fixing to be working on it. since I paid off the last 2 classes I had. And I also am a Christian apologist. I'm academically trained. I'm not a layman. But she has a way of making that statement. I think she just does it to get on my skin, to be honest. All right, let's continue.
So he starts off by quoting me in my comment. And what I had said was, all that said, I think it's very interesting that you, me talking to Rob Carter here, had so very little to say about my thesis statement. Genetics cannot determine the created kinds. By no measure can one genetically link cats and lions and separate humans and chimps. If genetics cannot determine the kinds, what can? It isn't morphology. Are the Bergmans doomed to be ephemeral categories? What an odd thing for God to do, concealing a very critical concept in young Earth creationism. It is very reminiscent of the flood boundary debates, actually. So, I think that given the video you just watched, I can make a very good case for this. So Brian comes in with this. He says there's so much wrong with...
Actually, given the video we just saw, you can't make a good case for this.
...this claim. As already mentioned to you before, our position is not how much they are different or similar, but the kind of differences or similarities that make them distinct, kind or part of the same kind. Brian's grammar is going to be a little all over the place here, so...
She likes attacking my grammar, spelling, and I'm not doing a Shakespeare play. Okay, I'm not trying to impress a college professor with my high grammar and good spelling. I'm not doing any of that stuff. I'm writing in a comment section, and I'm not trying to be super grammatically correct. I just talk like people normally talk. Like if I sit there say, it's proper grammar to say it is I, but most people don't say that. They say it's me. That's just how people normally talk. And that's just the way it is. Like when you list persons in a list, you're supposed to list yourself last and as I. Like me, like Donny and Rob and I all went out together or something like that. That would be an example of proper English. But instead, most people will say like me, Donny, and I, or me, Donny, and Rob Carter. That sort of thing. That's how people would typically talk. And so I just talk like what most people would typically talk. I'm not trying to watch my grammar and make sure I got perfect English in every way. It's really the content of my arguments that really need to be evaluated, not my grammar. She's not my professor, and I'm not hers, thankfully, because I would be failing her on her history for sure, even all the science. But I'm not her professor. And she's not my professor. So she does not need to be targeting my English and things like that, because it does not matter. I don't care what she thinks of my English or grammar or anything like that. It's the content of my argument that she should be focused on.
Be patient. You had strawmanned our position in your initial Tomkins response video on created kinds. So pause here, right? Because we're talking about genetics here. You can't say that the kinds of genetic differences matter and not specify what those kinds of genetic information actually are. He's just hand-waving at this kind of like nebulous concept of like, oh, well, it's the types of differences that matter. Oh, really, Brian? Like what? Can you name some of the types for me?
All right. So essentially, she does kind of like this argument from silence thing. Like I was just simply spelling out what we actually believe on the subject, and how she misrepresented our position. So that didn't require me to give any kind of specifics in terms of kinds. I thought that would kind of go without saying because it's kind of obvious. I mean, just look at them. You can see that there's morphological differences. You can see that there, if you are a geneticist, you can see the kind of genetics information. Like, for example, the way the 4 bases are ordered in order to spell out particular information, because you would have to have a string of those letters and so forth, those bases, and in particular order. It's not random. It's not random, as Dr. Rob Carter had mentioned. It's not random. And so this order will be in a specific way that would spell out certain genetic information that will that's required for them to have certain traits and characteristics and things like that. And these morphological characteristics and biological characteristics that result as a result of this genetic information will then be able to use that to distinguish what if they're the same kind or different kind. And she doesn't understand that. She thinks that they won't, and say, "Oh well, what kind?" I mean, in my comment to this video, I actually mentioned several different ways. Like in case of chimps and humans, I gave her an entire list in the comment section. It's like, okay, for example, primates has different phalanges, a different design in their fingers. They're designed for knuckle walking. Like if I put my hand on the ground and keep it there for a long period of time, like just put all my weight on it, and it will actually hurt after a few seconds, because our knuckles are not designed to be walked on like that. But knuckle walkers like primates, or at least most primates are knuckle walkers, not all, but most of them are knuckle walkers, that they normally not walk on their knuckles, like on a regular basis. They can walk on their hind legs. As Peter Lyon pointed out, that they could be optionally bipedal in that sense. They can, on occasion, walk on their hind legs, and some can walk more fluently on their hind legs than others. Whereas with some primates, there are primates, though, a lot of primates, especially chimps, that walk on their knuckles. Their phalanges are designed differently so that they can do that. Ours is not. Their arms are also longer for tree climbing and hanging off branches and things like that. Their feet is really not a set of feet like ours is. Our feet are designed to walk upright. Their feet are designed to climb, so their feet is actually just another set of hands. So it's like they have 4 hands and no feet, essentially. But their feet is really just another set of hands, and our feet are designed for upright movement. That's why we struggle when we climb trees, because we're not really meant to climb trees. So as a result, I mean, we can physically, but we struggle with it because our feet are not really designed to climb trees the way apes are. Again, their shoulders are also designed so they can hang from branches and things like that as well. And of course, you got facial features of them. They're very common among apes. Their fur, their skin, the texture of their fur and skin. We have hair instead of fur in specific spots, and they have fur all over their body. There's several of them have actual tails, like monkeys have tails and things like that. We obviously don't have a tail. Our tailbone actually is not actually a tail at all. We call it a tailbone. It's like right at the end of the base of our vertebrae, but it's not really a tail. It's not really a tail. We actually don't have a tail. Monkeys have tails. Things like that. So there are all kinds of different ways in which we can actually tell and distinguish them. I don't know why she wanted a list of things, because that makes no sense. It's like, how does she know the difference between a cat and a dog if you couldn't just look at these lists of similarities and differences and how they're similar and different to know that? You wouldn't be able to even classify them in family groups. I mean, even with our modern classification system, you would never be able to tell them apart. So how do you know that? How would you be able to do that? You would not be able to do that unless we are able to look at it and see, that there are certain kinds of differences and similarities that they have, and these common similarities that are fundamental to a particular kind is what makes it part of the same kind, and the fundamental differences distinguish one kind from another. Now, of course, there are superficial similarities. I mean, like all life would have some similarities, similar biochemistry and so forth. And so we would expect similarities between life, as long as it's superficial similarities. Superficial similarity would be like size, someone looking at human and apes and seeing that they both have hands and things like that. That's superficial similarities. Those are similarities, but it doesn't take into account the fundamental differences, such as their hands being designed differently, their feet being another set of hands, which we don't have, and things like that. So you can't just simply look at superficial similarities. But what I'm talking about, the fundamental similarities that really mark a ape or a chimp or whatever the case may be as being what they are. That's what I'm talking about. And so we have that. And she doesn't understand that. She seems to think, oh, well, give me a list. It's like, I mean, I take it for granted that that would be kind of obvious that you can give a list, but I don't understand why she thinks that would be necessary for me to give her a list here. It became kind of obvious. But so I'm not saying anything that doesn't strike as being obvious, that this is obviously true, but she seems to be disputing it, apparently.
Because humans share 99% of their coding base pairs with chimpanzees and around 95% if we're looking at the entire genome.
You notice how she just kind of assumed her position here. That's exactly what she did. She assumed her position here. And I told you, she throughout this video, misrepresentation, assume her position. Sometimes she did one or the other. Sometimes she did both. Here she is assuming her position. If my position is the way in which something is similar or different, then how could you sit there and point to the amount? Because that misrepresents my position in the process and assumes hers. And so essentially that's exactly what she's doing here. But in reality, let's assume, for example, now the numbers are actually wrong, but let's assume that humans and chimps really are 95% to 98% similar. All right. That means that there could be 2 to 5% difference between chimps and humans. All right. That 2 to 5% may be enough in terms of the fundamental differences between chimps and humans to make it impossible for the two to hybrid, to actually be able to interbreed. And that's enough to separate them as created kinds as a result. And the similarities, the 95 to 98% similarity could be nothing more than superficial similarities, or at least similarities in a way that does not prevent them from interbreeding. It is the 2 to 5% that end up preventing that. That's assuming that number was even correct. So in other words, our position does not suddenly fall apart if that turned out to be true. She knows that there are young Earth creationists that do accept that number. I don't accept that number. I don't think that number is correct. But there are young Earth creationists that do. And this does not somehow, if that number turns out to be true, does that automatically mean that young Earth creation falls apart? No, it wouldn't at all. Because our position isn't dependent upon the amount of similarity or dissimilarity that two organisms might be. Okay? And that's what I was trying to explain to her. It's not dependent upon the amount. Now, I do agree that the alignable regions are going to be somewhere between 96 to 98%. I don't think that's the numbers are artificial. Because it doesn't include the algorithms. The algorithms involved are designed to look for similarities, not differences, and because of that, they do not look for dissimilarities. And so any major dissimilarities in the genome, any large scale differences, the algorithms just kind of skips over them because they're trying to find alignments with similarities. So we would expect that the percentage of similarity they find will be in the high 90 percentile range. Now, what happens when we do factor in the unalignable regions? Well, since your pool of data is increasing, and most of this increase is coming from differences, then what will happen is this will drop your similarity and increase your differences. And since the amount of increase would be significant, because there's a lot of the genome that's being skipped over as a result of these algorithms. They're being skipped over. So because of that, this is going to drop the similarities significantly and increase the differences significantly. How much so, I don't know for sure, but I would bet it's somewhere in the 80s. Richard Buggs in 2018 said that when he did it and he factored in the unalignable regions, it came to 84.38%. 84.38% is what he came up to there. And that was in 2018. Now, since then, we've got some more up-to-date genome sequences, and nobody's done anything major with those, at least. And but when they do that, when they do the T2T and when they're almost got the chimp genome fully sequenced. So more than likely, a lot of people are waiting for that to happen. But when they do that, and then they factor in the unalignable regions, I believe it's going to probably come to less than 90%, most likely in the high 80 percentile range. If it is above 90%, like in the low 90s, 91, 92%, I'm open to that, but I'm very skeptical of it. I question whether it would even be that. In fact, if it's even 90%, I'll be surprised. So I honestly think it's going to probably follow somewhere below 90%. Maybe anywhere from 87 to 89%, possibly. As well, I think it's going to end up falling into. But we'll see. Can't commit to it at this time because we haven't done that study yet. But maybe one day we will. Tomkins' study did a study on it, didn't factor into the unalignable regions. I'll get a lot more into that and discussing the unalignable regions as well when I do my video, weighted versus unweighted. I can't wait. I'm going to be doing a lot of technical stuff in that video. I'll be going through statistics and so forth. So it's going to be cool. Also, this is not hand waving either. This is not hand waving. This is simply giving spelling out what our position is. And like I said, I took for granted that it would be kind of obvious that you can list differences and similarities, but apparently she does. Now, of course, I'm not a geneticist. I don't look at genomes all day long, so I couldn't tell you exactly how the bases would be ordered to spell out this kind of genetic information. I just know that it would, because otherwise just the list of differences, the morphological differences, the biological differences, and similarities would not be possible unless the genetic information, did spell out to produce these biological and physiological characteristics and so forth. So I just kind of took it for granted that would be obvious, so I didn't think that I would have to. But apparently she seemed to want a list, so I did give her one when I responded to this video in the comment section of her video.
So I'd like to know what kinds of genetic information are different between humans and chimps and would serve to separate the two of them while uniting things like lions and cats, or like dogs and foxes, for it.
It sounds almost like she's looking for the same kind of similarities and differences between chimps and humans versus lions and cats. But that's silly, because if you're dealing with two different organisms, then and you compare those two, the similarities and differences between those two organisms is going to be different from the similarities and differences between two other organisms. So that's just silly. That you don't determine created kinds by that specific, like a specific criteria differences and that sort of thing. You don't do that, because the differences and similarities are going to be different for every organism. So there's similarities and differences between chimps and humans, for example, is going to be different from, say, rats and mice, or lions and cats, and so that sort of thing. And so the object of it is the way in which those two things are alike or different in terms of the commonalities and fundamental commonalities, that they're not superficial, like in the case of size or some things that are similar with all life, like biochemistry or something like that. But whether they're fundamental in saying that particular creature has these features. All these creatures have this particular physiological characteristic, or morphological characteristic, or genetic characteristics, or whatever, or genetic information, or whatever the case may be. That's the object of it. So it's not about having a specific similarities or differences or something like that, because they're going to be different every time you get to any pair of organisms. So that's just a silly argument. It's like she's looking for a specific similarity, like if chimps and humans are different because they have another set of hands or something like that, then does mice are different or similar because they have another set of hands. You know, that's a silly argument, because they're going to be differences. They're going to be different types of differences and different types of similarities that are going to exist. And so it doesn't make no sense, because you're dealing with different pairs of organisms. So this is just, it's a ridiculous argument. But creationist positions don't change, and we look for the way in which two organisms are alike or different.
Instance, this is the problem that you're faced with. You can't just, like, appeal to a concept that hasn't actually been fleshed out.
The concept has been fleshed out several times. I repeated this concept to you, Erika, several times, over and over and over again, including after you did your original Tomkins response video. I've told you this. So you've been corrected on it multiple times, and it's been fleshed out, and I fleshed it out when I originally said it. When I originally said it in the post that I gave her, I fleshed it out. By fleshing out, what she really means is that I need to sit there and tell her what these differences are. Even though, granted, you know, me and other people like Dr. Jason Lau have spelled out these differences and to her that show that they're not the same kind, and she still don't get it. But in any given case, they've been fleshed out to her. She just doesn't want. She just wants to believe that somehow that we can't really give an exact understanding of what they are, even though people like Donny from Standing for Truth, myself, Dr. Jason Lau, and others, they've all told her what we think on this issue, and she still doesn't get it. But yes, we have fleshed it out.
Now, my point with Jeffrey Tomkins is that Jeffrey Tomkins says that secular science is wrong. Jeffrey Tomkins says actually the similarity between humans and chimpanzees is a lot lower than secular science would have you believe, and thus that humans and chimps are much less similar. My point in the Tomkins video is that if you use Jeffrey Tomkins' methods, multiple other pairs of animals that creationists accept and in fact insist are related are less similar than humans and chimps. And that is still the case. So,
all right. First of all, she misrepresented our position again, over and over again, including in the original Tomkins interview, because our position doesn't depend on how much they are similar or dissimilar. Now, her arguments do, but not ours. So, in other words, even if she had replicated Tomkins' method, and this was my point, even if she replicated Tomkins' method correctly, and she didn't, we'll get into that in a second. But even if she replicated Tomkins' method correctly, okay, it wouldn't really matter. If she were to go like, well, that makes them less similar than chimps and humans, and okay, so, well, that would make, you know, rats and mice less similar than chimps and humans, and therefore chimps and humans are the same kind. No, that doesn't make that at all. And if she asks, okay, do you still accept, if that was the case, do you still accept mice and rats as the same kind? Yes. Do you, what about chimps and humans? Nope. Created in the image of God. Nope, we're not the same kind as chimps. So, you know, it's, or any primate for that matter. I don't even accept the classification of us being primates, because that's just the evolutionary presuppositions being filtered into the classification system. But that's not relevant to our position, because our position is not over the amount, not focused on the amount. It's the way in which these things are different or similar. That's our position. So it wouldn't matter even if she replicated Tomkins' method correctly, it wouldn't. And I was right, and that is the case. Now, did she replicate Tomkins' method correctly? No. In her original response video, which she's replying to here, she basically does a global percent alignment of all of the spurious alignments in each search result, and that gave her bogus numbers that was not in agreement with what Tomkins did. And so she did not replicate Tomkins' method. In her newer video, she weighted it by dividing by the query length, because of what Glenn told her, because Glenn Williams is her source for that. And that's just not the case either, because Tomkins actually didn't divide by the query length. We'll get more into that one in Gap versus Ungapped, which will be my next Tomkins controversy discussion is over Gap versus Ungapped, and we'll get into that and discuss that then. But she never replicated Tomkins' method correctly anyhow, so it wouldn't matter either way. But even if she did, my point is that our position doesn't depend on the amount of similarity to similarity. I mean, why does she think that Rob Carter said that he doesn't really matter? It does not matter to him where it was, or where it fell, except maybe as an intellectual curiosity. Why does she think that people, even young Earth creationists that she likes, like Todd Wood would say, 96 to 98% similar, something like that, or other young Earth creationists that might be open to those numbers? Why would she understand that they did that? You think that they did that inconsistent to their YEC positions? Or do you think that they're being consistent with their YEC position because their YEC position does not focus on that, on whether or not if humans and chimps are related? And so I was talking to Dr. Kurt Wise through internet or through email several times, and we were discussing this as well. He doesn't commit to it because he's never actually studied it, but he usually tries to just take the evolutionary viewpoint on it because he never studied it, and so he just kind of takes. Well, he doesn't commit to it in a precise way, but he's just like, he doesn't question it if he doesn't know that much about it. He just kind of take the mainstream view of evolutionists and that sort of thing on the subject matter. And me and him was talking back and forth, and both me and him agreed that the amount would not matter at the end of the day, because it wouldn't really matter if it's 85% or 98% or whatever, because that doesn't impact created cons. And so nobody thinks that as a young Earth creationist that somehow our position is now held into jeopardy if that becomes the case. It's only that, evolutionists like Erika who thinks that that's somehow going to impact our beliefs and views on created cons. In reality, it actually does not impact it. And she doesn't understand that. And I've tried to explain it to her many, many times. I'm probably going to, after this video, unless me and her have some further discussion on it, I'm going to try to get away from just talking to her about it. This is probably going to be her position for a long time. And so there's nothing I can do to change her mind on it. But I do know this much. Every time she does voice this, especially to me, I'm going to point out that she's misrepresenting our arguments. Okay, it's one thing to assume your own argument, but it's another thing entirely to be attacking our argument and then assume that our argument should be her argument, and it's not. And so she ends up attacking a misrepresented view of our argument. But in any given case, okay, let's move on.
You are not scot-free on this one, Brian. In fact, you're in deep trouble.
No, not in deep trouble at all, actually.
He goes on to say, also, the whole challenge in your video was against Tomkins' method. If this was your thesis statement, then you'd defend that statement and tried to justify it throughout the course of your work, but you did not do this. Mentioning a claim once but never justifying it through the course of your video is hardly a thesis statement. When thesis statements are given in papers, they are followed up throughout the body of the paper in an attempt to try and justify the claim, but you did not do this in the video. That's wrong. Yeah, I don't know, like Brian claims that he's watched my video multiple times. He continues to show that he did not, in fact, do that.
All right. I did watch it multiple times, and the fact that I don't agree with you doesn't mean I didn't watch it multiple times. But here's the thing. This is one of the reasons why I know this. If she had backed it up throughout the course of her video, or at least stated it, it should have been throughout. I would have remembered it, and I don't remember her doing it at all. And I've seen her videos like millions of times. And so the likelihood, if she mentioned it all, it would have been once or twice. Now, she did make a point about the created kinds toward the beginning, but not in such a way that was her thesis statement, that you couldn't tell the difference between created kinds, only that she thought that Tomkins's arguments or method would not work, and when you use created kinds as controls and that sort of thing, and that's just not the case, because she misrepresented our position on created kinds in the process. But she never stated that she thought that, at least not in that video that I've seen, that I don't think she mentioned it at all, be honest. But if she did or alluded to it in some way, it was once or twice. It was something that would not have stirred in my memory directly or indirectly. And as a result, I do not think that she did it quite often. She should have done it throughout the course of the video. She said that's wrong. All right, back it up. Show some clips from your video. Show clips that are found periodically throughout your video where you supported this thesis statement, or argued for this thesis statement, or explicitly claimed this thesis statement, or even alluded to this thesis statement, and all throughout the course of the video. She did not do that. So what she should have done was try to back up her claim on this, and she did not back up her claim.
He says, furthermore, your claim had all kinds of factual and logical problems with it. Even if true, and it's not, see below, it would be like someone claiming that if a radio has no screen like a TV, that it can't be used for entertainment value, but this is a non sequitur, as it were. However, even if you can't prove it genetically, there are other ways, such as biological and morphological. Ah, yes. The two categories, biology and morphology. So again, we've already gone over why you cannot use, I'm assuming he means interbreeding here, or morphology, but also, take a shot, because we have our regular helping of creationists using things that don't reproduce as a means by which to create analogy to living things.
All right. For start with, you don't need. My whole point was that you can sit there and justify something by different ways. There are different ways to prove something. It's what I was pointing out. Even if you couldn't prove it genetically, there are other ways. Now, personally, I think that you can prove it genetically, morphologically, and biologically. And by biologically, I wasn't necessarily talking about interbreeding, but you can actually prove created kinds by interbreeding. She's wrong that she thinks that interbreeding can't prove created kinds. Yes, you can, because that's one of the big deals, if you can hybrid between them. Now, if they can't, because of mutations and things like that set in since the fall, because if they don't interbreed, does not necessarily make them not part of the same kind. Like foxes can no longer interbreed with dogs, for example. They could be their own kind, but I don't know if they are or not. Now, so there's always a possibility that and lions and cats are part of the same kind, but they cannot interbreed with each other. They're part of two different, at least as far as the modern classification system, they belong to two different genuses, and they cannot interbreed with one another. But yet they're part of the same kind. So it's possible that you can have two things that are the same kind that can't interbreed, but not possible for them to be able to interbreed, but yet not be part of the same kind. And I don't think she understands that either, but that's essentially it. But the point of my analogy here was not to, it didn't require it to interbreed or produce offspring or anything like that. Because the point of it was that you can have multiple ways of proving something without, just like only one way to prove it. Like if you can't prove it by this, you can't prove it any other way, and that's just not the case. You can't prove it other ways. That was my point, and that didn't require my analogy to involve anything interbreeding. Which, by the way, if I did was involving things that are interbreeding, then that would be actually beg the question, because I would have to assume my position in the process, and so the only way to avoid that is by using things that are non-living. That way I can avoid begging the question, assuming my position as I'm trying to argue against her position. So that's why I used that as an example. It prevented me from begging the question. But she didn't understand my analogy, or she just completely ignored the context of that analogy entirely.
And also, again, we have a misunderstanding of why it is that we have nested hierarchies. It's not just random assortments of things that group organisms, it's successive assortments that become more specific.
Now, of course, nothing I said had anything to do with what evolutionists believe on nested hierarchies. In fact, I wasn't even talking about that, and my analogy was not in any way referencing that. So she just kind of brings this subject up that is completely irrelevant to anything that was being discussed. This is called fallacy of irrelevant thesis, and it had nothing to do with my analogy, the point of my analogy, anything I was saying, anything that we were talking about. It literally was just completely irrelevant.
He doesn't seem to understand that. And then he,
I understand it. It's just that's nothing to do with anything.
Explains morphology to me, even though he knows that what I study is gross morphology. Again, my lab is a comparative morphology lab.
Actually, no, I didn't know that. I knew she was a primatologist. That's all I knew, is that she was a primatologist. I don't know the specifics of her laboratory work or anything like that.
But I can appreciate that. As a woman, I often need these kinds of things explained to me.
Notice the job there. I said nothing at all about her gender. In fact, that wasn't even on my mind when I sat there and wrote that. So it's almost like she just automatically went there. I don't know, maybe she's had other dealings with other people. Maybe she thinks that's what's on other people's minds. I don't know. But that was not what was on my mind. I didn't write that for that reason. I said nothing about her gender. Listen, Erika, to me, it's not your gender. Not at all. I got people that support my channel that's of the same gender as you. Okay, your gender is completely irrelevant to what the issue is. The issue is over what you are saying and what you're arguing and the content of what you're producing. That's the problem, not your gender, not at all. I would never, ever suggest that your gender is the reason why you don't understand something or anything like that. That's not me. That's not the way I argue. That's not the way I present myself. That's not the way I am as a person. Because I'm not sexist. I'm not anything like that. And so that's not my view at all. And so I don't appreciate the insinuation that that's what was on my mind or why I was spelling it out. I was spelling that out more or less so that you understand that morphology, even though it's basically about the shape or the form of something, like the study of the form of something. So you can actually, and of course, since our genes, our genetics results in, that we can look at morphology and determine morphological similarities and differences.
The word morphology comes from two words, morph, which means shape or form, and ology, which means to study up. Thank you, Brian. So together it means the study of one's shape or form. Genetics is the study of genes, chromosomes, and the genetic information that exists inside DNA. A person's shape or form is when all that genetic information has been combined. I'm just going to let you guys hang on that one. Feast upon it in the comments.
There was nothing wrong with my statement. That was factually accurate. And I haven't read all the comments, but the ones that responded to me never said nothing about that. So apparently I don't understand what her issue is. Like I said, she didn't really go into it.
Essentially, it is the completed organism, but the organism carries a particular form that is different from others. You can tell these distinctions without ever looking inside a microscope. This is the creationist conundrum. They want it to be morphology until they don't, and then they want it to be genetics.
It's not either or. This is either or fallacy. No. It is actually both. Morphology derives from the genetic information that's there. And the morphological differences is obvious as well. You can prove it by genetics, but you can also prove it by morphology. You can prove it biologically. We can prove it, created kinds on those, all three of those can be proven that way. So it's not, either you prove it morphology or you prove it through genetics, and you can't have both. It's like, no, you can. So yeah, genetics and morphology and biology, you can prove created kinds by. It's not an either or situation.
Donny of Standing for Truth does this all the time. Now, again, it doesn't matter if you use genetics or morphology. Humans are apes, and our closest living relative is chimpanzees and bonobos. So this doesn't help you, Brian. You can use morphology, you can use genetics, it doesn't matter.
All right, notice how she just kind of assumed her position. They're the closest living relatives. It's like, no, they're not. You just basically just assumed your position was correct, is what you did. That's all she did.
This claim also violates a law in logic called the law of identity and is factually inaccurate. The law of identity claims that A is A and not B. Simply put, something is what it is and is not what it is not. Like, Brian continues to start to try and do some bizarre, like, philosophical tap dance here, but he doesn't understand that we are within the realm of the empirical here. We're not doing Platonic ideals.
All right, Platonic ideas have to do with Plato. Nothing I said had anything to do with Platonic ideas. This tells me that she basically didn't even read what I wrote, or she didn't understand it. Logic, it's referring to, there are three laws of logic. There's the law of identity, there's the law of non-contradiction, and law of excluded middle. What I was referring to is what's called the law of identity. The law of identity says that A is A and not B. Essentially, something is what it is and it's not what it's not. This chair is a chair because it has all the defining characteristics of a chair. It has none of the defining characteristics of a couch. Therefore, it is not rational for me to call this a couch just to label it a couch. And so it would not be okay just to label us as apes when we do not have the defining characteristics that makes an ape an ape. And so she was violating the law of identity just by calling us apes when we do lack the fundamental characteristics that are very commonplace among apes and other primates. And so it would not be rational to refer to human beings as apes as a result. It would violate the law of identity. And she didn't understand that. She thought I was throwing out Platonic ideas, which is not true. She said, we're dealing with empirical science. Understand something. Well, first of all, evolution is not empirical science to begin with. If it was science, it'd be origin science. It'd be historical science. And historical science always is interpretive anyhow. As a result, and because you always have to apply your assumptions to the data. But historical science is like when you use modern tools of science to try to extrapolate things back in the past, and in doing so you have to make certain assumptions about the evidence because we weren't there, and so you can't use empirical science on a past event. It's just not possible because empirical science requires observation, which you can't observe it because it's in the past, and repeatability, which you can't repeat it because it's in the past, and experimentation, and you can't experiment on it because it's in the past, because you have to have it in front of you to experiment on it, and so you can't be able to do that with a past event. And so evolution would not qualify as empirical science anyhow. But if you talk about genetics in general, then yeah, genetics, biology, those kinds of things are empirical sciences. Except for evolutionary biology, which tries to combine empirical science such as biology and try to merge that with evolution, which would be classified as historical science, even though technically evolution is really pseudoscience because it's really not science at all, especially in the empirical sense. But at any rate, if you are going to look at empirical science use logic all the time. In fact, all the hard sciences really use logic. The soft sciences, the social sciences and things like that, they use logic, but not as much, which explains why. See, Erika is a primatologist, and she's a PhD student for paleoanthropology, and both of those are social sciences. They're more softer. They're what they call the soft sciences. Hard sciences are like chemistry, physics, biology. These things are hard sciences. And they typically end up using logic a lot more than the soft sciences do. And so I use logic in all areas of science, but empirical science, things like empirical science, hard sciences, use logic a lot in these, especially the hard sciences, the chemistry, biology, physics, things like that, use logic a lot. Where the soft sciences will use logic, but not as much. Which explains her lack of training in this. She didn't even understand my argument at all. She didn't understand. I don't even know if she understands what the law of identity is. The law of identity is one of the 3 laws of logic. It is not Platonism. Platonism has to do with Platonic ideas, ideas that they originated from the Greek philosopher Plato. None of what I was saying had anything to do with Platonic ideas. And empirical science requires logic. Science, in fact, science itself, empirical science is actually a type of science called inductive reasoning. It's an inductive, that's the kind of science, or the kind of reasoning it is inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is when you argue from specific to specific or specific to generalities. Deductive reasoning is when you argue from generalities to generalities or generalities to specific. In the case of inductive argument, remember your inductive reasoning, you're arguing from specifics to specifics or specifics to generalities. And so that's the whole scientific method is inductive reasoning. And so science is built around logic. So this idea of she kind of does kind of a hand waving thing here with my argument and just kind of waved it away and says, oh, well, I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And that's just not the case.
But that doesn't matter. He continues on. He says, we can tell this in genetics, biology, and morphology. Again, so like genetics and morphology are both nested within biology. If this was not true, as you implied, how do you tell if a dog and a cat are not the same kind of animal? Why isn't your dog a cat? You said in one of your videos that you have lots of dogs. How do you know that they're dogs and not cats or insects? So again, morphology can be used to determine groups of animals. Your problem is that they also group humans with the other apes, and creationists cannot have that. The entire point is that kinds cannot be determined in such a way as to group animals in a standard way that gets them all onto the ark and allows for enough time for them to diversify afterwards. That still doesn't work, but, give them that, just say that's okay, while simultaneously separating humans from the other apes.
All right. Okay, for start with, morphology does not combine humans and apes. That's false. She may be confusing that with the modern classification system because that's the way people classify them. That's not the same as that they are. Look at us, Erika. Look. Okay? Do we look like apes? Look at our face. Look at the kind of hair we have, skin tone, our body, our shape, the way we are. Do we even look even close to the primates? Monkeys, apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos. Do we look anything like them? Do we have the same fundamental characteristics that make them what they are? No, we do not. So morphology does not agree with you on this. Morphology would be very different. It would show that we are not chimps and humans. Even if you really believed with all your heart, and I think you probably do, Erika, that we evolved from some sort of apish primate, we would not be the same thing that we evolved from, because because we're completely different from them. So you wouldn't be able to argue that at all. And so you don't understand the law of identity clearly. But you cannot use morphology to determine that. You said that genetics, that we can't use those genetics and that sort of thing. That's false. We can. You said in order to get them on the ark, we can. You said that of course, then you have to have enough time after the ark to biodiversify. We had enough time, but studies that have been done on this, and John Woodmore has a book out called Noah's Ark: A Feasibility Study, and he's got some really good studies in there as well on both done by creationists and evolutionists concerning biodiversification. When you got two different two animals, two different of the same kind in an ecosystem, and they will biodiversify real quick. Add the fact that they would not have had to worry about predators for a while in a given ecosystem, because most ecosystems were uninhabited. So you would be able to sit there and get away. At first, they'd probably be completely uninhabited if nobody was there, but they will quickly biodiversify a lot faster when they don't have to worry about predators and things like that. So I can imagine in 4,000 years they'd biodiversify real fast. They could. The studies that have been done on this show that biodiversification can happen in a really short period of time, even within our lifetimes, or just beyond it even. And so we know that this happens. So we can actually sit there and biodiversify real fast. But she said, okay, I'm going to give you that. She said, in order to separate humans and apes, that assumes evolution. They don't need to be separated because they're not together. Why would I need time to separate them before getting them on the ark if they're not if they're completely separate to begin with? That's like sitting there saying that I can't get a dog and a sheep, on board unless I can separate them from each other. Well, they're not the same kind, so I can. They're two different kinds, so they can come on there. And so, apes and she just basically assumed evolution in the process. The humans evolved from apes, that sort of thing.
That's your primary problem. So morphology can tell us like the general characteristics of Canidae or Felidae. That's what I do all the time with hominids and with primates generally. But genetics is your through line of relatedness. I explained this earlier in the video. Genetics quite literally tells you an ancestor-descendant relationship. Comparative genomics can do this with species.
Genetics can tell you relatedness, but not the amount of. You can't really use the amount of genetic relatedness or genetic similarity in order to claim that they're related. But they can tell relatedness by the way in which something is. It seems to me like she wants to go back and forth on it. She wants to say that morphology and genetics and things like that could not tell created kinds, but then turns around and say, yeah, you could tell different family groups and that sort of thing, but you wouldn't be able to use them to be able to you wouldn't be able to use them to show that two different things of the same kind, but you can use them to tell if they're related. And it's like she's bouncing back and forth in a crazy shotgun spread sort of way. It's just like she's all over the place with her arguments. It's like, okay, do you think that morphology and genetics can tell the same kind? She'll say no. But then I say, then what about the family? I mean, you think they could tell family? Oh yeah, you can do that. And what about this? No, you can tell if they're related to each other through genetics. And well, why can't you tell them if they're the same kind? And it's like she's going back and forth. She wants to avoid saying that she can, admitting that you can tell if something is the same kind or not, but at the same time, she can't take away from her belief in the modern classification system in the process. So she bounces back and forth as a result. Also notice she didn't really answer my question. I asked whether you can use morphology for that, and she basically said that you can, but that you can't use it to determine kinds. And so it just seemed like I've got a note written here. I'm gonna just say my note real quick. Notice she did not answer my question. Didn't answer my question. Her argument was that you can't use genetics, biology, and morphology to prove created kinds. I argue against that, and then she admits that you can use morphology, but then conflates this with how they are being classified. She is being very inconsistent here and is switching back and forth. So as she's challenging us here, so she's just kind of going back and forth with her arguments, and it's really crazy and out there, and it's spread out, and it's like she wants her cake and eat it too. She's not going to admit that you can determine created kinds from morphology, genetics, and biology, but at the same time, she can't deny it in terms of the modern classification system. So she's just kind of all over the place with her argument. Of course, genetics is used in she brought up the inheritance thing. She mentioned earlier in the video. I talked about this. You can use genetics in relatedness in terms of the way in which something is similar or dissimilar, not in the amount, because that would be irrelevant to whether it's related or not. You could take a human being, and two perfect strangers, and genetically compare them. They're going to be within 4% of each other in terms of differences. So they will have 4% or more differences between them. So humans tend to be extremely similar to one another. She even said that in her original video, actually, when she was talking about her self-to-self analysis. And you can't sit there and say that just because that genetics is about how much they're similar or dissimilar. No. It's about the way in which they are similar to dissimilar, because they pass on certain traits from their parents, and their parents have passed on traits to me. Their parents passed on traits to them. Their parents passed on traits to them, and so forth. And so this went down the line until it got to me, and now it's to my son, and so forth. So a child will carry traits from both of their parents. I mean, that's just the way it is. They would carry those physical that genetic information with them, those genes, and some of them are going to be dormant, some of them are active, but it has nothing to do with the amount of similarity to similarity. And of course, I think she's misrepresenting my argument as well in this, because she thinks that, and a lot of her supporters were like this too, they felt that I was against using genetic similarity. I'm not against comparative genetic similarity or comparative genetics or anything like that. I'm okay with you comparing two different organisms as long as the object is to look at the way in which they're similar or dissimilar, not in how much they're similar and dissimilar. And she seems to be focused on how much they are similar or dissimilar rather than on the way in which they're similar or dissimilar from each other. And so that's what she is not focused on. And I'm saying that in the YEC position, that's what we're focused on.
He says, can someone do a genetic study involving what makes a dog a dog? Sure they can. In fact, in one place I remember saying I wouldn't mind seeing a genetic study done on this. I don't know what he's trying to say here. It's the same problem as with morphology. So you can come up with your archetypal dog genome and say that any divergence plus or minus X amount of base pairs within that ideal is not a dog, right? Or is a dog. But the problem with that is you're going to have things that appear very dog-like that are like one base pair too far. That line is always going to be arbitrary. Always. Because genetic variation within organisms is smudgy. I talked about this earlier in the video.
Okay, not smudgy, and again, she assumes her position on this. That assumes the amount of genetic similarity. We're not talking about how many base pairs that are involved. We're talking about the order in which the base pairs are involved in order to spell out specific genetic information that creates certain morphological similarities or dissimilarities in order to make something what it is. That's what we're talking about. So, in other words, of course, you're going to have like a string of these bases, of course, and they're going to be in particular orders in order to spell out that genetic information. I'm not a geneticist. I don't look at genomes all day. I don't know what that would look like exactly. I just know that that's the case, and that's the reason why we wind up having the morphological differences and similarities that we have with different organisms and so forth. And so if you've got two things of the same kind, then they are related by way of the kinds of differences and similarities they exist. Not and two different things of two different kinds are distinct from each other from the kinds of differences that they have. They're fundamental that separates them. That's the object of it. And I gave like several different differences and similarities or differences earlier between chimps and humans. We can give others for like dogs and cats and so forth. Like for example, you can't look at superficial similarities like the fact that dogs and cats both have four legs. Lots of animals have four legs. In fact, most most animals on Earth are quadrupedal. they walk on four legs, so that's not unusual to have four legs. So that's a superficial similarity. Size will be another one. Different animals are different sizes. Now, in some cases, like in the case of insects, size typically are fundamental to describing that particular animal. But in other cases it's not, and it varies because from what I understand, I think tortoises and turtles they can grow to any size. Technically, if they live forever, they could go to a big turtle. But because I don't think that, from what I understand, they're not limited on their size, and their turtles shells can actually grow with the animal, and so size it depends on the organism, but in most cases size usually is superficial similarity because it's like I said, you got animals big and small, and some kinds will actually have big and small versions, species within that kind, and that happens too. But they're still part of the same kind. And so, but in terms of like physical characteristics and morphological distinctions, they are very fundamental to that particular kind, and it's going to differ depending on which pair of organisms we're dealing with. The similarities and differences between humans and chimps is going to be different from the similarities and dissimilarities between humans and mice, or mice and rats, or whatever the case may be, because you're dealing with two different pairs of organisms. But anyway, so it's not arbitrary at all. The line is not arbitrary. One thing, it's not even involving the amount of base pairs. It's the order in which the base pairs appear in a string of information, and that becomes genetic information that tells these morphological similarities or differences.
And then he talks about a conversation that I had with Dr. Korf, who's going to come up later. He says, can you do biological studies on the concept of the creator?
No, I wasn't talking about her conversation with Dr. Korf. Why would I be talking about her conversation with Dr. Korf? I wasn't privy to that conversation. I knew about it a little bit from Dr. Korf, but I was referring to Dr. Korf conversation itself is what I was referring to. So I was not talking about that. I wonder if she really even looks at the context of what I'm saying, or even what I'm saying half the time. But no, I wasn't talking about her conversation with Dr. Korf. I was talking about my conversation with Dr. Korf.
kinds? Yes, you can. What about morphology? Can you make out morphological distinctions between kinds and morphological similarities within some kind of organism? Absolutely. If you couldn't do this, how would you tell your dog from a cat, a human from a chimp, an elephant from an insect, etc.? So this is not like the flood boundary at all. I think you just don't understand what we believe on created kinds. Your entire thesis statement is demonstrably false. God bless. So, I hope that you understand why I decided to make this video. Because if Brian...
That last statement, she doesn't even deal with, by the way, at all. She does not understand what we believe on created kinds, for sure. I'm going to get to my conclusion of this whole video here in a little bit.
Is our average or even close to average late creationist, then most of them don't actually understand.
Nope, not late creationists. I've got a full-blown ministry. I've got a YouTube channel. I have a degree. I'm a Christian apologist and Bible scholar. So how in the world am I just a late creationist? I don't know. I really don't understand what she means by late creationist, except maybe in contrast to what she calls professional creationists. And that's just not the case. But anyway, there's nothing lay about me.
Why comparative genomics is used to tell how closely related organisms are, or how morphology is used to categorize organisms. And this just so happens to create these nested hierarchies.
Again, we're not even talking about nested hierarchies. That's going to be a subject for later on discussions. But in any case, morphology shows that she's basically confused that with like the way in which we classify them today. And that's just not the case. And the morphology, I think, will agree that chimps and humans are separate, because once you look at the morphological fundamental differences between humans and chimps, they're not the same thing. You'd have to presuppose your evolutionary views to try to argue that. And much of the modern classification system, unfortunately, presupposes an evolutionary interpretation. And that's what you have with a lot of these categories, these classifications and so forth. They're not really based on morphology as much as they are based on evolutionary presuppositions.
And in fact, I don't think he really appreciates that genetics is what it is, right? He doesn't seem to understand that genomic similarity is quite literally how we tell that any two organisms on the planet, within a species or between species, are related to one another.
Again, this is a strawman argument. I never denied that at all. Not in my comment to her, not in my any discussion I've ever had with her, and not in this video. But she misunderstands that and assumes that it's the amount of similarity or dissimilarity rather than the way in which something is similar or dissimilar. And I'm all for genetics. I'm all for morphology. I'm all for biology. I don't agree with the evolutionary presuppositions, but I'm all for those things. And so, and some of her supporters also mistakenly thought that I was somehow against looking at genetic similarities, and I'm not. And she should know, given my placement in the Tomkins controversy series and me having a full-blown series here, responding to her, she should know that I have no problem with looking at genetic similarities, as long as we're looking at the way in which two things are alike or different, not in how much it's alike or different. Now, of course, even then, you could still look at how much something is alike and different, for intellectual curiosity, and that sort of thing, and that's fine. You could do that, but would that disprove our position of young Earth creationism? No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't disprove it at all, and that's my point. And she doesn't understand that, and she misrepresents our position constantly. I will cover the conclusion in a few minutes. I want to hear the rest of what she has to say.
Right? Why can we use genomic comparisons to tell paternity in humans or generate family trees in humans, or to tell how closely related two species within Felidae are versus how different they are, but you can't do it outside of these arbitrary lines that creationists have drawn?
That's not correct at all. You can, but you're assuming the modern classification system, of course. But you can sit there and look and see what kind of kinds they are. And they're not arbitrary lines at all. They're not arbitrary lines at all. how is me looking at fundamental difference between chimps and humans arbitrary? Like the fact that the hands are designed differently, or the shoulders, or their feet, or the fur, the skin, their body mass, all these things are completely different. Their facial features, in terms of the fundamental facial features, I'm talking about slight differences, because humans can have slight differences in facial features, such as the slants that Chinese and Japanese usually have on their, Orientals usually have on their eyes and stuff. That's a facial feature, but it's not fundamental that distinguishes them from humans. But the fundamental features in case of apes is, because you compare, like if you compare two different chimps to each other, then you can see the similarities that they have. All chimps, all primates, all apes, etc., have certain fundamental similarities that compare them. So if you compare them with humans and we lack that, then we know we're not an ape, we're not a chimp, we're not a bonobo, or whatever the case may be. We're not an orangutan. We're not any of these things. And you can tell that we're not. And it becomes kind of obvious as a result. And so what I'm saying is very commonsensical. So I don't understand why she seems to have trouble grasping this and assuming that somehow these lines of differences are arbitrary. How is looking at similarities and differences arbitrary? It's not arbitrary at all. But yeah, I'm going to finish up here and do my closing statement on this. Alright, what is my overall thoughts about the video? As per usual with Erika's videos, I was very disappointed in this one. Her response videos, at least. Her response videos are never very good. And I didn't expect much from this. But one of the things I found very common, she made lots of errors in this. Lots of logical fallacies, lots of factual errors. She made a historical error. She misrepresented our position a lot. And misrepresentations were very, very common throughout this. In fact, one of the things that I found was that she would do, like, she would either misrepresent our position, or she would assume her position, or she would do both. She would misrepresent a position and then assume her position. And the latter will happen a lot frequently than anything else. So she was doing that constantly throughout the course of this video. So as per her usual response videos, I found it very uninformative. She made a lot of factual errors, logical errors. She misrepresented our position when I expected that. I did expect her to misrepresent our position, and she misrepresented our position all throughout the video. All throughout her video, she misrepresented our position. And she assumed her position was correct. She assumed the modern classification system was correct. She strawmanned our arguments many times, including with Noah's flood, assuming all the animals that exist today was on it, or that we would have to separate humans and chimps and things like that. And so her whole video was a mess. It was just wrong. It seemed like she wanted to go back and forth on whether you can use morphology and genetics. And then when I point out that you can use it to show the created kinds, she wanted to deny that. And then say, no, you can't do that. But then when I point out for family, she said, oh, well, we can use it for that. It's like her arguments were just like all over the place as a result. So anyway, again, not a very good video, not a very good response. She misunderstood my analogy of using the TV analogy and radio analogy. She completely misunderstood what I meant by it and the point that I was making. She kept trying to make this about nested hierarchies when I wasn't even talking about that at all. And so it was one bad argument after another. And that's typical of one of Erika's response videos. It usually makes back-to-back errors. So constantly throughout the course of the video, throughout the course of her arguments, she's constantly making one error after the next. And so that was typical of this one. It's always a really botched idea that she had trying to respond to me when she's misrepresenting her position. It sounded more like the whole video was designed to justify her misrepresentation of our arguments. And she clearly did. Even if two different kinds it's always possible that two different kinds could be less similar than in terms of the amount of similarity or dissimilarity, than two things that are not the same kind. In YEC position, that's true. Because it's not about the amount of similarity, it's the way in which something's similar. This does not mean that the lines drawn are arbitrary. It doesn't. That's not what that means. It doesn't mean it's arbitrary at all. It just simply means that that the way in which two different pair of organisms are similar or different are going to be different from the way in which two organisms are similar or different, and it's not dependent on the amount of similarity or differences, whether it's dependent on the way in which they're similar or different. And a lot of evolutionists don't understand that. And that's really what the issue is about, too. It's not about the fact that two organisms change over time, or organisms change over time. We all agree that organisms change over time. It's also not the amount of change. A lot of evolutionists try to make it look like it's about the amount of change, like they'll say that, like she tries to define it as more or less, where she misdefines kinds. That's not what we believe. You can have big changes within a kind. I mean, that's possible. Just because it's the same kind don't mean a major change cannot happen. You lose a lot of information, and this could develop a new species or whatever within that kind, and a lot of loss of information, a lot of big changes happening, and that sort of thing. It's not about the amount of change. It's about the direction of change. It's about the way, the kinds of changes that are being made, the way in which something is changing. And that is the issue. That is what we have a problem with it. If it was just over the amount of change or the fact that organisms change over time, then there would be no debate. We'd all agree. It's the way in which you're claiming that organisms change over time that's the issue. Like what creationists are claiming is a vertical change happening, when you guys are claiming a horizontal change. As far as the evolutionists go, you're claiming that a horizontal change is happening, and that's just not the case. It's a vertical change, and the only thing we ever observe is a vertical change. We don't ever observe a horizontal change. That's the point. And I honestly, it's getting to a point where in Erika's videos, it's hard for me to sit there and just respond to one of Erika's videos anymore, because they're like this. they're really bad. It just kind of gives you that. A lot of YouTubers call it cringe effect, where you just gotta get cringe, like, did she really say that? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. My next video on the Tomkins controversy I think is going to be Gap versus Ungapped. I'm going to be mostly responding to Glenn Williamson, aka Roohif, and I'll be responding mostly to him, maybe partly to Erika, but mostly to Glenn Williamson. That's going to be on next time on Tomkins controversy. But that's going to be a little bit away, because my next video is going to be in the Genesis series. So I'm going to be doing an episode in that. I got an interview this week with Dr. Georgia Purdom over mutations and natural selection. And so me and her got like a 30-minute interview, and so it's going to be a short video. And I'm trying to get one with Dr. Bodhi Hodge from Answers in Genesis also. He wrote a chapter in one of the resources along with Dr. Georgia Purdom. And of course it's found on the website of Answers in Genesis, where he wrote a chapter on the created kinds, and I want to do one. You say, what, Brian, you just did a created kinds video. Yes, but I want to try to get one for the Genesis series as well. If I don't, then I'll just have to wait until Nathaniel Jensen. He's my first choice on this, but Nathaniel Jensen, unfortunately, not unfortunately. I'm glad he's doing this, but he's doing book writing right now. He's writing a lot of books. I don't know if he's writing multiple books or just one book, but he's saying several months he's tied up with that. But of course, I could always wait until I do my flood videos to do the critic con if I need to. But right now I'm trying to see if I can get Brody Hodge to come on here, and we'll see if we can discuss that, because I want to discuss speciation, and I may even just try to see if I can sneak in something on so-called nested hierarchies. I want to kind of sneak some of that in and have that kind of discussion as well. But anyway, so hopefully maybe I'll have my next 1 or 2 videos would be on the Genesis series, and then I can jump back into the Tomkins controversy after that. I've got a lot of stuff to do, a lot of content that I want to present for the Tomkins controversy. A lot of really good stuff, a lot of good material for both Gap versus Ungapped. Gap versus Ungapped is going to be a big video. Weighted versus Unweighted is also going to be a big video. It's going to be a lot of technical stuff in both of those videos, and I've been doing research on both, and it is I can't wait to present it to you guys. So if you're not subscribed to my channel, get subscribed, like the video, give it your personal thumbs up, and I'll just look at the camera and give a thumbs up. Hit the thumbs up icon, and make sure you drop me a comment below. Don't forget to hit the notification bell, and I will see you on the next one.